It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, the co-host of the weekly podcast, Film Seizure, that you can catch every Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, we're coming back to the world of Darren McGavin's Carl Kolchak in 1973's The Night Strangler. The Night Strangler follows up the incredibly popular 1972 TV movie, The Night Stalker. However, this movie would turn out to be just as popular as the first. It was popular enough for two paths to ultimately open up. The first idea was to make a third film, which would have been called The Night Killers, which would be set in Hawaii, where Kolchak would uncover this whole plot dealing with UFOs, nuclear power, and people being offed and replaced by android duplicates. The second, well, that's what would end up happening. ABC wanted to take the character to series. The only two people who would ultimately return for the weekly series would be, of course, Darren McGavin and Simon Oakland as Kolchak's irascible editor, Tony Vincenzo. This film also has something interesting that wasn't exactly unheard of in the 70s. When The Night Strangler went to TV as the movie of the week, it ran, minus its commercials, for only about 74 minutes, which was the same as the first film, The Night Stalker. However, ABC wanted to ship the movie overseas as a film to play in theaters. So to do that, they added 16 extra minutes to round the film out at a full 90-minute feature. Other TV properties like Buck Rogers and Battlestar Galactica would get their pilot episodes released in theaters as well later in the decade. I'm not sure if it was an effort to make more money off of what's likely to be very expensive TV movie productions, or if it was a way to help sell the series that the pilot was setting up. Either way, it wasn't all that uncommon, but was a practice that probably ultimately died out with the home video recorder phenomenon that would start up by the early 80s. Alright, so where did we leave Carl Kolchak? Well, he had been in Las Vegas, having been run out of several towns back east for his tenacious practices as a reporter. He helped uncover the fact that the killings of several women around town were actually committed by a real vampire who had been alive for quite some time. He and an FBI friend of his actually killed the vampire outside the law, and in order to keep all of this under wraps, the powers that be from Vegas forced both Kolchak and his fiancée out of town, never to return again. However, they did it separately, and Kolchak was never able to find his girlfriend again, despite him flushing his entire savings trying to track her down. So with that, let's go to Seattle, where Kolchak has resurfaced. And again, Kolchak records his story on a tape recorder, and yet again, he is reporting a full story. He says that facts, details, names, and records were either erased or falsified. And we see then a girl who is on her way home, and she works as a belly dancer at a Seattle club. She's followed and eventually snatched and strangled by an unseen assailant. Later, Tony Vincenzo is coming into his favorite watering hole where he hears a man raving on and on about vampires and truth. That person, of course, is mightily familiar to him. Sure enough, Vincenzo is reunited with Carl Kolchak. And Kolchak asks for a job, and Vincenzo takes him to see his publisher, who is played by John Carradine in this. And Kolchak gets hired, and against his best judgment, Vincenzo puts him on the case of the killed belly dancer. Now, Kolchak starts making his usual rounds, but as usual, he doesn't make too many friends. The cops won't have any of his business. The club that the dancer was at is somewhat helpful, but it's not exactly like he's going to meet too many savory types there, and some of those people may be a little cagey about information, if you know what I mean. So he ends up talking to one dancer who is a bit of an airhead, so not really getting any extra help from her. But he meets Louise Harper, yet another dancer, and she's played by Joanne Flug. Now, she might be helpful, but doesn't ever seem to really have time to talk. She's a co-ed who goes to school during the day and dances at night. But she does say that she assumes that with Seattle being such a big port, the murder is probably in Japan by now. But of course, she is wrong. Another body is found, but Kolchak doesn't really get too much more information until the press conference the following day. There he learns that each victim had a small puncture hole at the base of their skull that also indicates a fairly insignificant amount of blood was removed. And using his guile, Kolchak is able to get into the morgue where he finds that all the victims had crushed throats. The necks also had residue of what appeared to be rotted flesh, as if they were strangled by a dead man. Now, Kolchak meets again with Louise, and she doesn't quite give him a whole lot of info. However, she is friendly, and he does learn from both her and the airheaded dancer that he met earlier about the underground tours where people can go in and see the original version of Seattle before a fire happened, and then they rebuilt Seattle over the ruins of the old version of the city. Now, Kolchak begins doing some research, and he learns from a record keeper at the newspaper that 21 years ago similar killings happened. All the details seem eerily similar. Crushed throats, incredibly strong killer, rotted flesh that would seem to be that which belongs to a corpse. Now, the next killing does have a witness, and this woman says the killer didn't go after her and that he looked like a dead man. And all the while, despite all this evidence and this witness and everything, Vincenzo is really trying to resist publishing all of the stuff that Kolchak has found, but some stuff is getting out there. In addition, the record keeper has Kolchak visit again, where he finds out more killings happened between March 29th and April 16th in 1931. The murders are always women and always at the same time every year. But then he gets this another idea to keep going backwards in the records, and sure enough, every 21 years, during the same 18 or so days in the spring in Pioneer Square, killings happen. And they at least go back to 1889. Now, the newspaper was founded in 1887, so Kolchak will have to keep digging deeper. The police wouldn't allow their sketches of the killer be released to the public, but the paper brings in their own artist and that eyewitness, and the paper publishes a sketch, and it gets Kolchak and Vincenzo in some hot water with not only John Carradine, but with the police themselves. Now, Kolchak is nearby the next time a murder occurs, and he, along with the cops, try to chase this killer, but the killer is incredibly strong and is able to basically toss them all around pretty easily. Kolchak is able to snap a couple of pictures, but the police chief takes the camera from him, and he's basically forced to go home without any evidence. But he and Louise decide to go to the underground tour, and they sneak off of the tour, and they think they find something interesting about an open bottle of booze that's sitting on a table in a place that looks like it's a little bit lived in. But it's actually only a tramp who's played by Al Lewis from the Munsters, who basically just lives there just off the tour's path. He later learns from Professor Crabwell, who's played by the Wicked Witch of the West, Margaret Hamilton, about a fabled elixir of life. And it is a little bit alchemy when you really get down to it, but if you mix the ingredients just right and take the proper treatments, say, maybe every 21 years, somebody who's taking that can possibly live for a really, really long time. But here's the thing. He has to get a new batch of the elixir because when time runs out, he quickly decomposes. The next victim is the airheaded dancer that works at the club with Louise. When Kolchak goes to the police captain, he explains that he should really post women cops in Pioneer Square because they're running out of time before this guy will disappear again for another 21 years. The captain does explain that, they do their own research too, and there are a lot of inconsistencies with what Kolchak found. Some murders are a little inconsistent, particularly the number of murders that happened during that time. Some witnesses claim that the killer is actually good-looking and does not look like a dead man. There are also too many things that don't quite line up that really begins to poke a lot of holes in Kolchak's story. However, the record keeper that he's been consulting has found a story in which Mark Twain met with a Dr. Richard Malcolm who talked of immortality. Dr. Malcolm was a Union physician in the Civil War. He is also, potentially, Dr. Malcolm Richards, who founded a hospital on the same spot as Dr. Malcolm's clinic way back in the 1800s. But Kolchak is arrested for drawing a beard onto the painting of Dr. Richards in this new hospital's lobby to basically make it look like the known pictures of Dr. Malcolm. And with this, the history of Dr. Malcolm and Dr. Richards start to line up with the 21-year murders, with various details about disappearances, weird skin diseases, and more coming to light. So, Kolchak thinks that he's got all the facts lined up now, but the police captain, David Carradine, and Vincenzo are kind of equally dumbfounded and a little unimpressed. After a private conversation between those three, Vincenzo ends up telling Kolchak that he is off the hook, but the story will be killed so that the police can handle this their own way. So instead, he and Louise go out to try to get the proof they need. Kolchak gets separated from Louise, which almost causes her to get killed, but instead she's picked up and driven to safety by the cops. The captain also picks up Kolchak. What they don't realize was how close they were to finding Dr. Richards, who was just right around the corner. And he's now free to stalk his next victim. And now that he's killed that other person, the killer is going to be able to go to ground for the next 21 years. But Kolchak soon discovers that there has to be some sort of a way in and out of the basement of the old Richards clinic in town. So Kolchak finds the killer's lair, and he tells Louise to give him 30 minutes, and if he's not back, call the police. And while he's down there, he does find the dead body of the Al Lewis tramp, but Kolchak also finds Dr. Malcolm / Dr. Richards' home, and where he retires to live during the 21 years that he's not seen. And he finds a man who is maybe about 40 or 45 years old. He also has the corpses of his family down there as well. And this good doctor has gone a little bit crazy because he continues to communicate with the corpses as if they are still alive. But Kolchak learns that in 1868, that was the first time that Dr. Richards or Dr. Malcolm took the elixir. He discovers that the best blood to take is 1, from women, 2, from their brain, and 3, in the 7 seconds immediately following their death. In 1889, things went south for the doctor, and he had to kill again and take the elixir over the course of 18 days. The doctor is still looking for a perfected version of this elixir so that he can live forever without any further need to do it again or take more doses. He's about to take his final doses for this 21-year cycle, but Kolchak destroys the vial that it's in, and with the effects of the previous doses he's taken over the last few years, they begin to go in reverse, and Kolchak watches as the doctor decomposes rapidly. The police arrive just before Dr. Richards throws himself out a window and to the ground of Old Seattle. Kolchak's story appears to be published, but the publisher got involved and stopped the presses and changed the story. Kolchak's out of a job again, but so is Vincenzo. Together, they argue endlessly in Kolchak's car, and with them, in the back seat, is also Louise, who is also pissed at Kolchak and how he seemingly ruined her life too. And they are all leaving town to head to New York City. So let's get to my 3 things that I like about Kolchak's second adventure, The Night Strangler. First up, he was my third like last time, and he's part of my first like this time. Darren McGavin is phenomenal in this role. But what makes this even better this time around is how he interacts with Simon Oakland's Vincenzo. As Kolchak investigates, he keeps bringing info back to an increasingly frustrated and irritated Vincenzo, but Kolchak is absolutely giddy. He reads about how the eyewitness accounts of the killer through the ages all describe a corpse-like visage with cheekbones protruding out of the skin, and he's just positively lit up with excitement, while his editor just doesn't want to hear it anymore. It's very playful how they interact, and their scenes together are just simply fantastic. And you can see how, even by the end of this movie, there was never a plan to not have Darren McGavin and Simon Oakland together, however Kolchak would continue. Now, the second thing I want to call out is the increased humor in this. I mentioned it about earlier, was that Kolchak's pure joy of working on this case, despite knowing that it will get him into hot water all over again, is just great. Some of the Darren McGavin voiceover is also really funny, where he admits to spending a day with Louise as not having anything to do with journalism. That's just, it's pretty smart writing and just fun dialogue. It's showing that he has an attraction to this woman without actually having to go through all of the courtship and romantic stuff that would have just really kind of gotten in the way. Then he reveals to her about what happened last year in Vegas, but he tells her this story while they're riding an elevator to the top of the Space Needle, and the elevator's packed. You don't really realize that people are listening in on this conversation until they get off on the top floor. And when they get off the elevator, the others are just stunned, and they kind of lean out of the elevator and just stare at Kolchak as he's walking away. It's great because in that scene in particular, it actually shows you how other people react when they're just hanging around an important exposition dump between characters. You don't normally see stuff like that. You always see people in the background of a shot. Like, are they looking at the people talking? Are they trying not to be noticed? Are they looking at the camera? Well, in this situation, you kind of see that, but you actually get that payoff too. It's really hilarious that we finally get to see that opportunity where somebody is actually reacting to what characters are saying to move the plot along. You also have Al Lewis making a small appearance in this, playing that happy-go-lucky tramp in Old Seattle. And it's a nice moment of levity that's just really pleasant and helps set this tone that I always feel is there in a Kolchak story. There can be monsters and killers all about, but you're actually going to have a lot of fun watching it. Thirdly, as much as I like the idea of Old Seattle being used as a setting in various parts of this movie, and particularly in the climax, I like the idea of the killer even more. And sure, you can say this movie follows a very similar formula to The Night Stalker. You can say that the subsequent 20 episodes of the Kolchak series follows, yet again, another, the similar formula again and again. But the bad guys are always interesting. In this, we have a fairly unique idea. There's a person who's figured out the elixir of life, or at least a version of it. He's a Civil War vet who went to Seattle to set up shop as a doctor after the war. He had an interview with Mark Twain at one point about immortality and figured out the exact ingredients to prolong his life, at least for 21 years at a time. It's not that it's super original to have an immortal being basically harvesting something from the living to prolong that person's own life, but all of these pieces of what this guy's history is, the details of this person, and when he needs to kill again, for how long, and what causes him to disappear each time, that's fairly unique. And I also like that earlier on, he's decomposed, and then after killing however many he needs, he starts to look more and more like a relatively attractive middle-aged man again. It's a little bit Count Dracula, it's a little bit Jack the Ripper. It's just a neat villain. And speaking of Jack the Ripper, that's who Kolchak will come up against when we see him next, later this year, when we look at the first episode of the Night Stalker series. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles each and every Friday morning. Now, next time, we're going to start another Hammer horror-themed month with The Curse of the Werewolf, which happens to be the first starring film role for young Oliver Reed. Until next week, stay spooky.